Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Enigma. I cannot believe we're now into the 60s for episodes. I'm not sure how that happened. Now, I've said to you once, and I'll say it to you again, if you're not working on your personal brand, somebody else is doing it for you, and you're not going to like the results. You've got to be proactive, you've got to be systematic, and you need to get a little bit of advice as to what it's all about. So come back to me, join me as I will be with Gabrielle Dolan, speaker, author of many books, including the fantastic one I have here, Magnetic Stories. So do not miss this episode, because this is your story and your brand.
You're listening to The Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
Hey, hi, Gabrielle. How are you? Well, you've got to love that for an intro, haven't you?
It's a massive intro. I was dancing along to it. So good, Adam.
Now, I know you've done a lot of these podcast interviews, and so I hope that was just mildly impressive for you anyway.
It was genuinely very impressive.
Thank you so much for being a guest on the Leadership Enigma. It's wonderful to have you. And let's start really by asking you, just give the listeners a little bit of a background about you and how you've got to this place in relation to being a real guru on, personal brand and storytelling. But how did you get here?
Yeah, well, that's a question I often ask myself. How the hell did I get here? I started my career, Adam, I feel really old when I tell people this, because I started my career in technology as a mainframe computer operator. And I don't even know if companies still have mainframe computer operators anymore, but that was in the 80s, smack bang in the middle of the 80s. Good times, the 80s.
Yeah.
Anyway, I worked in corporate all my life. I worked for one of Australia's largest banks. I, worked myself up to senior leadership roles. And my last couple of roles at the bank were in sort of change management and leadership design and delivery. And that's when I sort of started to notice that as a leader, the really good way to communicate more effectively was through stories, and that the stories that you shared could actually get your message across more importantly, and you could influence people. And so I left the corporate world 17 years ago and started teaching business people how to communicate more effectively through stories when storytelling wasn't really a thing. So I run training programs around the world. I do speaking at conferences, and I've just published my 6th book, which I do. I think, when you said, how the hell did you get here? I actually failed English in my final year of school, but I've just published my 6th book, and the latest book. While the previous 5 books have been around storytelling internally and real authentic leadership and real communication, the latest one is a switch of focus around storytelling with brand, because I think I'm sure we'll talk about why brand and why brand storytelling is important.
We will. And everyone's got a story, which I love to hear. And you're right, the 80s were fun. And it's not about age, is it? It's about our wisdom. And that's certainly what I want to tap into, Gabrielle. So tell us a little bit about brand. What do we mean when we talk about brand? Because people will be listening to this and thinking, well, I have a personal brand. There's perhaps an organizational brand. So what do we mean by brand?
Yeah, and it is, but we all have a brand. Every company has a brand. Even perhaps department even has a brand. Even maybe a product or a service has a brand. But every individual has a brand. One of when I was writing the book, I did a whole lot of research on brand and found all these quotes. And one of my favorite quote around what brand is comes from Jeff Bezos, and he said that your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. And my tweak on that is your brand are the stories people share about you when you're not in the room. Because, I mean, as humans, we tell stories. It's the way we communicate. And what I think people say, like if someone said to me, hey, what's Adam like? I'm inevitably going to tell a story. I could go, oh yeah, he was good or he was bad. And I have a story to why I have formed that opinion of him. So to me, if your brand is the stories people are sharing about you when you're not in the room, then brand storytelling is how you take control of those stories.
Wow, I'm feeling a little bit self-conscious now. I must admit, Gabrielle, as I'm thinking about what is the story that you might be telling people. Wow. Now, I know you've got some. Can you give us kind of an early example so that we can kind of understand that? Maybe a good example or a bad example. I don't know. You decide, so we can kind of understand that. Bring it alive, personal brand.
Bring it alive. Yeah, look, let me. I'm going to share a story. It's one of my favorites when I was researching for the book, and I think it goes to the heart of what the power of what a story could do. So it's not about an individual, but it's about. Well, let me just share it with you. When I was growing up in the 80s that we've discussed, I was a massive tomboy. You'd find me playing football or cricket or riding my BMX bike and skateboard. I wasn't into dolls, and therefore I never owned a Barbie.
Right.
And when, the last couple of decades, Barbie sort of copped a bit of a bad rap for being a bad role model for girls, unattainable body image and all that. And I happily went along with that. And when I've got two daughters that are 17 and 20 now. And when they were born, I never bought them a Barbie. And I think I even told people not to buy them a Barbie. I was like so dead set against Barbie. And then when I was researching for the book, I discovered the backstory to Barbie. And the story goes that in the 1950s, Barbie was invented by Ruth Handler, who was the wife of one of the co-founders of Mattel that makes Barbie.
Right.
And this was the 50s. This was in the 50s. And she had two children, a son and a daughter called Barbara and Ken. And yes, Ken and Barbie are named after their kids. What she noticed that when both of them were playing with their respective dolls, they both imagined themselves as adults. And why Ken was encouraged to see himself as a firefighter or an astronaut or a superhero, the only thing Barbie could see herself was a caregiver. So Ruth pitched this idea of a 3D doll with clothing that would allow the little girl to pretend to be something else besides just a caregiver.
Right.
And it wasn't initially, she had to push to get it in, but she did get it in. And in 1959, Barbie debuted at the New York Toy Fair. And there's a quote from Ruth Handler that says, "My whole philosophy of Barbie was that through the doll, the little girl could be anything she wanted to be. And that Barbie always represented the fact that a woman has a choice." And as soon as I heard that story, it completely changed my opinion of the brand, like completely changed it to the point where I never bought my daughters a Barbie, but I may potentially buy any grandkids that come across a Barbie. And that's the concept of a magnetic story, that it completely can change the way people think about you or talk about you or the stories they share. And the sad thing, Adam, is I was researching for a book, so I had to look really hard to find that story. And I thought, what a missed opportunity that isn't front and center on their website, and what a missed opportunity that isn't on every single Barbie product.
Yep.
Wrapping, because that's the power of a magnetic story. It's once you hear it, it can ultimately change the perception people have of you. Now, I know that's it's not even of a company really, it's of a product, but I think it highlights what a really, really good magnetic story can do.
That's a fascinating story, and I didn't know that, because Barbie is an iconic product, but for some reason that story got buried. So how does that happen? How does that happen that such a powerful story got buried? Or is it over time that wasn't a compelling story decades ago, but it's a compelling story now? I don't know. How did that happen?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I think, it's a compelling story now, and surely it was a compelling story 20 years ago and 30, 40. Yeah, it's nothing changed. I think a couple of things happen, and this was one of the reasons I wrote the book, is I don't think people understand the power of it. I don't think people would understand the power of that story. So they're not highlighting, they're not amplifying. And I think that's why, like you said, it can sort of become buried. Now it is there, but it's buried. Where if they understood the power of it, then you would go, okay, let's bring this out and shine a light on it and not bury it. And so that's why I think it happens.
So I need to ask the question, which is obviously based on your book, which thank you so much for sending this to me. So we need to really understand, what is a magnetic story? How does somebody identify a magnetic story in relation to themselves? So let's start there. What is it for someone?
Yeah. So one of the hardest things, Adam, writing a book is landing on the title. It's just like I always have a working title in my head, and it's never ever been the title.
Right.
And I was coming up with all these things. I knew I wanted to call the book something that typified what a good story would do. And in my head, what a good story, like the Barbie story, does, and I can give you heaps of others. What it does is, once you hear it, you have this instant attraction to it, like this automatic instant bang attraction to it that's really hard to pull away from. Like, it's really hard to forget. It's really hard to change your opinion now that you know that story. And then I sort of thought, that's very much like a magnet. Like, a magnet is just this instant attraction that you actually have to work hard to pull away from. So that's the concept of a magnetic story.
Okay.
I remember when I was thinking of a name for my book, my husband came to me and said, "I've got the perfect name for your book." And I said, very scarily, "What?" And it was just like, and he went, "Teflon stories." And I just looked at him and went, that is the complete opposite of what I'm trying to get across. I go, Teflon, like everything slips off it. And he went, "Oh yeah, that's right." So anyway, it did give me a good starting point to say, are your stories magnetic or Teflon? So are they sticky?
I get where he was coming from. To be fair, I understand that, but you didn't go with it.
Yeah, he was coming from the complete opposite direction I was coming from, but
But he was trying to be helpful, Gabrielle.
He was trying to be helpful. That's right. God love him.
Now, in relation to magnetic stories, we know, don't we, that they can be deliberate or strategic. I think you mentioned. So help us understand that the difference between deliberate and strategic as regards magnetic stories.
Yeah, so this is it sort of comes down to your brand as well. So before you even start thinking about what stories you want to share to communicate your brand, you need to know what your brand is. Like, what do you like? Take control of your brand. And I think, because like you said in your intro, if you're not taking control of your brand, someone else is. It's just evolving. It's like evolves organically. So you can be quite strategic with it and deliberate in how you do it, or you can just let it evolve organically. But what I've found is that if you're not aware what you want your brand to be and it starts to evolve, it could take you down a direction you don't want to go. To give you an example, I was when I left the corporate world 17 years ago and was, teaching storytelling, I knew storytelling in business was still professional. It was still a very, very professional way to communicate, but it was different. And so I wanted my brand to be, my personal brand to be around professional but different, because I think it suited the brand of storytelling, professional but different. And so, the way I would dress, like, I'd speak on stage at conferences and I'd be wearing jeans, but I'd be wearing a blazer. So it was still professional, but it wasn't your typical corporate dress type thing, but it was still professional. So this is the way my brand evolved. And then about 5 years ago, I came across a pair of shoes. I wasn't really into shoes. I never liked shoes, but I came across this brand. They're a great Melbourne designer, and they're flat and they're cool and they're loud. They were silver and they were professional, really high quality, but different. So I thought, I'll wear these shoes. And literally, after wearing them a few times on stage and getting so much feedback and comments about them, it just became my thing, which I was happy about, because I thought, well, they're professional and different. Now, it's not as if I said to myself, I need to find some shoes that are professionally different. I just found these shoes I liked and it fitted with my brand. So it was aligned with my brand. So then I was happy to amplify the shoes. And in fact, in my last couple of books, there's been photos of me and my publisher says, your shoes have to be on them. Like it's got to be a full length shot to have your shoes on. So that was cool. But then another example, this was about 2 years ago. You've already said I'm a tomboy, so I'm not into nail polish or anything like that. But about 2 years ago, I got that SNS stuff that you put on. It's like this, it's sort of like fakeish stuff. And I didn't mind it. It makes you sound like you're typing really fast when you got fake nails on. Just tap, 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 tap.
I'm going to pretend I know what you're talking
Just pretend.
about. Now, even though I have a wife and a teenage daughter, I'm going to go with this, Gabrielle.
Just go with it. Just nod. But the point is, you've got to go get them done. And to get them off, you've got to go back to the nail salon and get them taken off. So it's a bit of high maintenance. And I had done it a few times, but thought it's not really my thing and I can't be bothered. So I'm not going to do it anymore. But then we went into lockdown. So this was March last year, we went into lockdown and everything shut. So you couldn't go back and get your nails done. So as a little bit of a joke, I put on Instagram photo of my nails going, I wonder how long these last because they just fall off. And then every week I'd update going, 2 fallen off. And I did this for about 3 or 4 weeks. And then what I started to notice is that there'd be stuff on fake nails and people were tagging me in it. And I'm thinking, part of my brand is about being authentic and being real, but I was starting to get tagged on posts around fake nails.
Okay.
And so because I'm aware of my brand, I just thought, I don't want to be known as fake nails. Well, first of all, they're not even my thing. But being associated with anything to do with fake is totally against my brand. So I not only stopped posting them, I actually deleted the Instagram posts I put on. And at the time, Adam, I must admit, I was thinking, oh, maybe I'm being a bit ridiculous. Like, no one takes that much notice. And I wrote about these 2 examples in my book. And I gave my book to quite a few of my clients, my long-term clients. And one of them came back and said, I loved your book. And when I was reading about your nails, I must admit, when I saw your post about your nails on social media, I must admit that I thought that's so against brand. So wow. I wasn't being precious. These were my clients that were seeing my little fun social media things, but they were thinking it's against brand. So if you're not aware of it, it can go down a track that you just go, how the hell did that happen? And it happened because you're not aware of it.
So that begs the question, and I'm thinking feverishly as I'm asking this as well, how does someone start to understand their own brand, the starting point for their brand? Now, that isn't necessarily someone who's just starting out in life or starting out in work, but could also be someone who's been around for a long time. I use myself as an example, and I've got this podcast, and I deliver programs all over the world. But how do I start, and how do the listeners start to understand the essence of their brand, that starting point?
Yeah, okay, good point. Because your brand evolves. Like, our brand, like if you're talking about our personal brand, it evolves. Like, and when you just think about it, the way you were when you were 20 and the way you are when you're 40, you hope it's evolved. Like you hope you've evolved in something. Like it'd be pretty
some
sad.
kind of organic change has taken place.
There'd be some organic change. And fundamentally, we're probably still the same, but there probably has been change. So the way when I work with people around this, I sort of go, what do you want your brand to be? So not necessarily what it is now, but what do you want it to be? And this isn't a wish list. This isn't like, it's still got to be realistic.
Yeah.
But I also think about, like, perhaps what do you want it to be considering your next job? So I would say put it out maybe 2 or 3 or 5 years time. What do you want your brand to be?
So thinking in the future.
Thinking in the future. Right. Now, again, I stress it's not a wish list. It's not saying, oh, I'm really detailed and I want to be seen as strategic. Okay, well, that's probably not going to happen, but it can be a bit of a stretch. So it's almost a stretch brand.
Okay.
And I would say, what if you had to get people to describe your brand, what would you want it to be? Like, say in 5 words or 5 phrases. So do you want to be known as a strategic thinker? Do you want to be known as innovative? Do you want to be known as a risk taker? Do you want to be known as integrity? Like, just think of what you want to be known for. Then I get people to do a couple of things. Then ask 5 other people. Just say, if you had to describe me in sort of 5 words or 5 phrases, what would it be? So you're suddenly going to get a picture of what people think you are now. And ask people that know you now. Don't ask people that you worked with 10 years ago.
I was going to ask that question. Who do you ask that question to?
Yeah.
So people who know you right now.
People know you well. You might ask people that work for you. You might ask really good clients. You might know suppliers. I'd keep it professional. I'd probably avoid asking your family.
I hesitate to even think what the answer will be.
No, you don't want to.
Family. Okay.
You don't want to go there, Adam. I remember, just a sidetrack, I had the privilege of going to Harvard about 5 years ago for an executive education program. And one of the things they said is ask 3 people really close to you if they could change anything about you, what would it be? And I made the mistake because we were out for dinner with the family before I left. So I asked, the family. My daughter, who was 16 at the time, in a nanosecond said, "I wish you would admit when you're wrong." And I was mortified. It's just like, I said to her, I go, "I don't think I've got a problem at all with admitting when I'm wrong." And she goes, "I rest my case."
Don't tell me she's going to be a trial lawyer.
I don't know. She will be. She will be. Anyway, my youngest daughter, Jess, who was about 12, she goes, "I wish when sometimes I say it's going to be hot or cold and you say it's hot and it's going to be cold." I go, "Well, there's an app for that, Jess. You can change it." And
great. There's great advice there. Don't ask the family.
Don't ask the family. My husband very wise.
Yeah,
my husband very wisely said he wouldn't change a thing. He's a very smart man.
He is a smart man.
So ask other people.
Yep.
And so what you'll get is you'll get people. So you might go, "I want to be known as a team player." And if everyone comes back saying, they're a team player, they're collaborative, then that's good. If no one says that, if no one says you're a team player, then it might be, it's not as if you're not, but maybe that's just something you need to start amplifying if that's what something you want to be known for. And so that's when we get to, okay, so how do we amplify it? This is when we become strategic about it. So that's when I'd be saying 2 things. What are some of the stories that you could share that shows you're a team player, that shows you're collaborative, and find opportunities to share them? So it's finding the stories that illustrate that. And then it's also, what could you do? What could you do right now that would demonstrate you're a team player or a collaborative? So it comes down to the stories you share and the things that you do that sort of generates those stories. To give an example, and this is an example of an individual, so it might be helpful, is I did some work with a woman. She was a senior leader, so she was pretty experienced. She was in her 50s and she was looking for a future role. And one of the future roles it was quite a strategic role but that involved managing risk. So the role she was looking at they needed someone to be able to manage really complex risk. And she said she was actually quite tiny. She was quite tiny, and she'd had a bit of a health scare a couple of years ago where she'd had a minor stroke, and she'd fully recovered.
Right.
But she says, "I think people are protecting me because they look at me and they know about my health problem, that they're thinking I wouldn't be able to handle those, roles that manage risk." And she goes, "But I know I can." And it was like, okay, so we need to find stories that demonstrate you can. So I worked with her to find all these stories, and she had so many stories. And I still remember the one she told me was about, when she went scuba diving off the coast of Mexico, and you just go, hello. It was just like, and she talked about, she was pulled underneath the water by an undercover rip. She came up, the boat was nowhere to be seen. None of the dive buddies were there except this one inexperienced dive person. Right. And so she went to them. She literally had to save his life and her life. She quickly talked through with all the things she did. And she just shared that story, and she actually shared it in the job interview, the saying about almost getting the message across. I take risks, and not only I take risks, I can manage risk, and I can make snap decisions in life-changing, threatening positions. And so she shared that story, and that story, like the Barbie story, it completely changed people's opinion of her, where they're going, wow, that's amazing. I didn't realize you did that or were like that. And so that's what a story can do. But she knew exactly the brand she was trying to get, and she knew exactly the story she then needed to share to amplify those aspects of her brand.
So, Gabrielle, I'm hearing a couple of things. There's got to be a level of congruence as regards the story you tell and the action you take. Otherwise, we're incongruent and then perhaps lack all credibility. So is that a fair point?
That's an absolute so first of all, there's two things. Probably the most critical thing, the story has to be true. So it's got to be, you can't make up stories. Like, let's not do that.
Yeah.
Good advice. And it's absolutely got to be congruent. So if you are sharing a story about you're a person of integrity, you've got to live and breathe that. So yeah, they're the two critical things, that it's got to be, this is not a wish list. It's not manipulation. It's not trying to pretend to be someone else. It's just going, it's authentic. This is genuinely me, but I'm just going to amplify some of the things that I want to be known for.
And that's really interesting, because I do a lot of work with leaders where we talk about their leader's shadow. And I get them to look at 4 quadrants: what they say, how they act, what they measure, and what they prioritize, just to understand whether they are congruent in the workplace. And there's no mischief to it, because we're all humans, and sometimes we say something, we do something that's the opposite, and it'll probably be our children who actually point it out to us. But we've got to be congruent. But also, I'm also interested, and this is the trial lawyer in me as well, when I think about the power of telling a story to a judge and a jury. There's something sticky and really compelling about a personal story. What's behind that, Gabrielle? Because as you say, when a story is told of this nature, it's not forgotten, or a very strong association is made between story and person. And why is that happening?
Yeah, look, there's so much science. There's a huge amount of science that proves that first of all, we're humans, so we're hardwired to tell stories and listen to stories. When we share stories, it taps into emotion. And again, as humans, we're emotional people. We make decisions on emotion. We just justify and rationalize on logic.
Yep.
And there's a huge amount of research that shows that when you tell a good story, a personal story, the listener not only has a connection to the story, but also the storyteller. So it can fast track trust and fast track respect and strengthen relationships. Too often, though, in business, Adam, is when we might be trying to communicate our company values, for example, or our own values. And because we're doing it in a business setting, we think all the stories have to be business related. Like, they've almost got to be case studies and stuff. And a lot of the time they're not even stories, because they're case studies, or they're so business related that there's no emotional connection. But when we share a personal story, it's almost like we can have this instant connection to not only the message the person is trying to communicate, but also the storyteller. So let me give you another example. I mean, we weren't going to do this podcast on storytelling without lots of stories.
I love an example.
Yeah. Cool. Well, there are so many times, Adam, I hear people talk about the power of storytelling, like for about an hour, yet don't share a story. It's just like
that's just mean.
It's madness. Anyway, let me give you an example. Yeah. I've got a client of mine. I've known her for a while, and one of her values is integrity. So she always talks about doing the right thing. And look, whenever she goes work for she works for large corporates. So they've either got a company value around integrity or honesty or doing the right thing or whatever. So she can tie it to that, but it's actually her own. And so this is the story she shares. And she would say whenever she goes and works for a new company, she shares this story. Whenever someone comes and works for her, she shares this story, because she said, in her own words, she knows the heavy lifting it does. So let me share it. I'm going to share it. I'm going to pretend her name's Anne. So I'm going to pretend I'm Anne, and just I'll ask you later, what do you get from that story? Like, pretend I was your new manager or working with you. So this is a story she shared. She said, in the early 60s, my dad was a professional swimmer, and he reached the point in his career where he actually tried out for the national swim squad. And the day of the meet, he was apparently winning his race, and he did the tumble turn at the end, and he slightly misjudged and he missed the walls. Now, this was in the early 60s, so it was way before sensors, the technology, the sensors in the wall. But and they had judges at the end, but with all the splashing and kicking, he knew they wouldn't know if he touched the wall or not. So he had to make a split-second decision. Does he go back and touch the wall, or does he just keep going? And he decided to go back and touch the wall. And you don't recover from a race when you do that. And he didn't. So he never made the national squad. And I would often ask Dad, are there days when you regret going back and touch the wall? And he said, and he'd always say, I've never regretted doing that, because if I didn't go back and touch the wall, I'd have to spend the rest of my life knowing I did the wrong thing. Yeah. And I'm sharing this with you because when I look at our value integrity, I think of my dad. It's only a matter of time before we will come across our own go back and touch the wall moment. And I invite you to consider what my dad will do.
Wow.
That's the story. So, like, what do you get at? Like, that's just such a powerful story.
It is a powerful story, because I think as you're listening to a story, you're starting to make connections. And as I'm listening to that, I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about integrity. I'm thinking about doing the right thing. I'm thinking about someone who's very principled. And in some ways, someone who has decided to craft a legacy. There was that split-second decision in relation to what will my legacy be? And I decide that my legacy will be authentic and true. And those are the things that are going through my mind. But you're right. But I think because we make those connections, it becomes powerful.
Yeah. So and I wanted to share that example because it's answering your question. It was like, what's so powerful about a story? Why does it create a connection? So it not only creates a connection to the message, the person gets their message across better, but it creates a connection to the storyteller. And when I run my training workshops, I sort of ask people, so what are you now thinking? And they're going, I can trust her. I have high respect for her. She's inspiring. I want to work for her. This is the standard she holds herself to. This is the standard she expects from us. So it's just like all these things, like just powerful, powerful story.
And so anybody listening to this right now, what could be their almost 3 or 4 point plan of what they should do, or the order that they should go through to start the process of thinking about their own personal brand and their own personal story with it? Kind of give me a little bit of a summary of what they should do.
Yeah. So start with defining what you want your brand to be. So whether this is you personally as an individual or your company or whatever, but what do you want your brand to be? Then it is look for stories from your past. And it could be, like Anne's story was about her dad. They don't necessarily have to be about you, but look for stories of when you have lived this value.
Right.
And most importantly, Adam, look for stories when you haven't lived the value. So sharing a story when you didn't, say you want to be known as honesty, like sharing a story of when you lied and to this day you regret it.
Okay.
They can be some of your most powerful. So if you share a story about when you didn't live that value, but the lesson you learnt from that, and especially if it's a story about when you're a kid, it's just like people go, wow, that, it's, you did something when you were 10, this tiny little thing, and it's still, you're still thinking about it. So by default, they go, okay, this really means important to you. So it's finding stories you can share, and then it's doing things that will create stories. So if you want to be known as generous, find stories that you can share that would demonstrate that.
Yep.
But what could you do right now to be generous? And once you're aware of that's what you want your brand to be, you'll find opportunities to be generous.
And there's that congruence again in relation to, so defining your brand. I'm making feverish notes as we've been chatting as well, Gabrielle.
Yep.
So defining that brand, looking for stories that support and actually undermine it, but what was the lesson learned? And then in the element of congruence is, and then doing things which support the very brand that you've defined. And we talked earlier, didn't we, about people being able to define their brand almost as a newspaper headline, so kind of 5 words, 6 words. Is that right? Is that the best thing as well for them?
Yeah, I think, yeah, and it doesn't whether it's 5 or 6 or 3 or 4. Just like, you know, if you wanted to be, you know, like, again, what are the stories people are sharing about you when you're not in the room? What do you want those stories to be? Do they want, and, you know, and evolve? And it's also a career wise too. I mean, I talk about evolving your brand. Early on in your career, you might want to be known as hardworking and diligent and stuff like that. But as you evolve in your career, I'm not saying you don't want to be known as hardworking, but you might want to be known as strategic.
Yeah. So
how do you just gradually evolve in that? And your brand is evolving as you are evolving as a person.
So, Gabrielle, how do people get hold of you? Because obviously I've got a couple of your books here, so thank you very much. I've got Your Stories, Your Brand, and Magnetic Stories. So these are now faithfully in my studio. How do people get in touch with you so they can carry on the conversation and find out more?
Yeah, look, I'm on LinkedIn and all the socials, but on my website, so gabrielledolan.com, if you're storytelling something you're interested in, on the website there's a free 7-day storytelling starter kit, so it's free, and it's, if you sign up to that, you'll literally get an email from me once a day for 7 days, and it contains a really short video, and it will just help you start thinking about how you could find these stories, where you could share them. So that's a good place to start.
I'm going to do that, Gabrielle.
You do that.
I'm going to do that. All right.
You do that. And all my books are available on, you know, all the usual, you know, Amazon and everywhere. So all the usual online and bookstores.
Oh, well, this has been great to chat to you, but I've got a final question, which I ask everyone, Gabrielle, and that is, what is the kind of most standout piece of leadership advice that you've given or received that springs to mind for you? That standout piece of advice.
I know it is the standout piece of advice. I know I was about 28 when I got it. And ironically, it's probably linked to this evolving brand thing, where my manager said to me, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. And I'm not sure at the time whether she was just talking about dress, as in what you wore.
Right.
But to me, it is that, but it's also metaphorical. So it's like, you know, act in the way the job you want. So dress for the job you want, not the job you have.
Love that. And I think we can link that to this episode in relation to storytelling. Yeah, no. And absolutely. As you say, thinking 3 or 4 years ahead of where you want to be and what you want to get to.
Yeah, and it is, I sort of say, you know, if you want to be an astronaut, but you're flipping burgers at McDonald's, maybe don't come dressed in a, you know, spacesuit, but.
Well, Halloween lends itself to all kinds of stuff, doesn't it? Which is, Gabrielle, listen, this has been absolutely brilliant to chat to you. Thank you so much. I'm going to do that program that you've just spoken about. So look out for my email and I can start to think about what I want to be when I grow up too, which will be fabulous. But thanks so much for being an amazing guest on the Leadership Enigma. I hope you've had fun.
Thanks, Adam. Hope it's been useful.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.